In this video, I'm going to show you how to decide whether any rental property investing is profitable or not using Excel. For this purpose, I have created an example, and in this example, we assume that in the December of last year, you purchased a single family rental house for $500,000 with 30 years mortgage and 3.12% APR, payable with equal monthly payment at the end of each month after the loan was issued. Further, we assume that you began renting this out immediately from January of this year, a few days after purchasing the house. The sales contract shows that the building cost $350,000 and then the land cost $150,000. You expect to rent it for the next 30 years for a monthly rent of $2,700 and sell it at the end of 30 years. Since the cost of the house can be depreciated, you decided to use the alternative method of depreciation. So under this ADS system, you use the straight line method of depreciation over recovery period of 30 years. Further, we assume that you expect to incur annual cost of $9,000 for miscellaneous expenses such as insurance, property tax, repairs, etc. And you make monthly payment to your rental mortgage but adjust income and expenses annually while you file tax. You can sell the property for $1.2 million in 30 years and you fall within 24% income bracket. If everything goes as planned, is this a profitable rental investment in today's dollar value? So this is a hypothetical example that I have created to teach how do we make this kind of investment decision. Once you know how to solve this kind of problem, you can easily play with the assumption we have made. For example, we have made this $9,000 annual cost for miscellaneous purposes. You can make this variable because that expenses may be very less in early period and that may be a little bit more in the later years. Likewise, the rental income that we have here is $2,700 per month. I have assumed that to be constant for the 30-year period. That's not the usual case. You can make that changes also. Maybe the rental is going to be a little bit less in the early period of this mortgage and maybe a little bit more in the later period. So you can make these changes to fit your need. But the basic idea here is how to set up this kind of problem in Excel and solve it. Once you are able to set up this problem in Excel and solve it, you can make the changes that you want to. So let's go to Excel and set up this problem and solve it. Here is our Excel file with some information from the problem. We have current property price, we have land price, house price, APR, loan term, property price in 30 years, miscellaneous annual expenses, monthly rent. So with this information, we have to compute what is going to be annual cash flow for this investment for the next 30 years. Once you have your annual cash flow, you can calculate net present value using Excel's NPV function, and net present value tells us how much dollar can you earn by investing on this project. Okay, so this is the way we are approaching this problem. So let's start it. But before I get any further, I want to emphasize here, we have divided this current property price into land price and house price because only the house price can be depreciated over the recovery period, which is 30 years. We cannot depreciate land. That's the reason we want to split the total property price into land and house. Okay, so first let's compute what is going to be your yearly rent, and as you know, this is simply your monthly rent times 12, right? So that's your annual rent income. What is the depreciation? And depreciation is simply the current home price divided by 30, right? So that's our annual depreciation. And here's a concept of book value I want to introduce. This concept is going to be useful. Let's say that you want to sell this house in 15 years, not hold for the whole 30 years. So how are you going to calculate book value? So this is useful concept to understand. That's why I want to elaborate a little bit here. Book value of your house is simply whatever may be the price of your house minus the depreciated amount. So if you hold this house for 30 years and you depreciate over 30 years, that means you depreciate the whole price of this house. In that case, book value is going to be 0. But if you want to sell this house in 15 years, how are you going to compute the book value? In that case, the book value of that house is going to be the current price of the house minus whatever amount you depreciate in the next 15 years. So that difference is going to be the book value. So this concept is very important. That's why I want to introduce how to compute book value. And usually book value is always equals to this, okay, which is the current price minus the total depreciated amount. For our case, our annual depreciation times number of years that you depreciate. For our case is 30, and this is going to be 0 for our case. But if you just want to sell that house in 15 years, then this is going to be a little bit different, not 0, right? So play with that, and tax rate is 24%. And once you have a tax rate, you can compute terminal cash flow. Terminal cash flow means how much cash are you going to get for yourself when you sell your house in 30 years, right? So when you sell the house, you have to pay the tax, right? So after paying tax, how much cash is going to come to you? That is the terminal cash flow. For our case, terminal cash flow is very simple, right? This is simply the selling price minus the tax rate times the selling price, right? That's the way you compute that, which is 912,000. Very straightforward. But if you want to also include the book value concept here, then this is how you compute the terminal cash flow, which is simply going to be your selling price of the house minus, you have to pay the tax, that's why you multiply this with the tax rate, times, now here's the trick part, then you have to do this selling price minus the book value. Okay, in that case, if you follow this formula, you can calculate terminal cash flow for any year. It may be 15 or 20 or anything, any year. So that's the way you compute the terminal cash flow, and this is exactly here 912,000. Okay, so we computed terminal cash flow. Now our goal is to go and compute annual cash flow for the next 30 years, right? Keep in mind, in our problem, we assume that we make monthly mortgage payment, but we make all the adjustment of this income and expenses annually when you file for tax. Therefore, I have here a table that can help us to compute our annual cash flow for the next 30 years. So here I have a period which start from 0 to 30, it goes to 30, and then I have here I payment, meaning this is going to be how much interest you are going to pay each year. We're gonna note here. Likewise, PPMT, what is the principal payment for each year? We are going to record that on this F column, and then we have a income for tax purpose. We can compute after tax income, and finally we are going to compute annual cash flow and use that annual cash flow to compute NPV. To compute annual interest payment and principal payment, I want to use Excel's cumulative principal payment and interest payment functions. For these functions, we need the starting period and ending period. For example, for year 1, starting period is going to be 1 to 12. That means you want to compute how much interest and principal you paid during that month 1 to 12. For year 2, it's going to be 13 to 24, which means you want to compute how much interest and principal you paid from month 13 to month 24. Likewise, for year 3, it's going to be 25 to 36. So for that purpose, I have created two columns here, column J and column K here. Column J for starting period and column K for ending period. You can simply type the numbers like 1, 13, and 25. Okay, you can do that, or you can also use a formula. For example, you want to compute starting period for year 1, then you can do is the prior period, which is 0 times 12 plus 1. So if you do this and drag this, grab this little square box and then drag it, that gives me the starting period. Okay, likewise ending period is pretty straightforward, right? So 12, 24, 36. So in this case, simply your period right here and times 12. So that gives me the ending period. Okay, I can simply double click and that gives me the ending period. So once I have this starting and ending period, I can go and compute interest payment and principal payment for each year. So for that, I'm going to go to formula, financials, and I am going to compute CUM IPMT to compute cumulative interest payment. Okay, right here, rate. The rate is going to be 3.12%. Okay, this is monthly payment, therefore it's going to be over 12. And number of period, this is the total loan period, 30 years, right? 30 years times 12, that gives me the total number of period. And the present value, that's the loan amount, which is 500,000, right? And then starting period, that's where I need these numbers. So starting period for year 1 is this J3, and for ending period is going to be K3 right here. Okay, and also we need this argument type 0 or 1, 0 for end of the period payment. So that gives me the interest payment for year 1. That means you are paying 15,455 towards your interest payment on your first year. So this is negative. I just want to make it positive. So I want to do this ABS so that handling of these numbers becomes easier later. So that is my I payment for year 1. So just double click it. It gives me for the next 30 years. Okay. So likewise, principal payment, you can just go to formula and then here CUMPRINC, and likewise the rate here is a 3.12% over 12, right? And then next number of period, which is 360, like 30 times 12, and payment is again, that is going to be 500,000, right? And the starting period, you pick from this starting and end period. Okay, and finally the type, therefore I'm going to put this 0 and enter. Okay, that's also negative. Let me put this ABS sign, ABS bracket close, right? And then just drag that formula. Okay, that gives me how much principal am I going to pay each year for the next 30 years. So that's my annual interest and principal payment. Okay, so now let's compute income for tax purpose. What is the income? What is expenses here? Keep in mind, income is our yearly rent, and expenses for this purpose is going to be all the miscellaneous expenses, depreciation expenses, and also the interest payment, because interest you pay on your mortgage is tax deductible but the principal is not. Therefore we can use this interest payment to reduce our overall income. Therefore it's going to be income is just like yearly rent, which is 32,400, and this is going to be same for the rest of the period. So I'm going to put that $, and minus your miscellaneous expenses, right, which is B7, that is also going to be constant. So I'm going to put the $, in between that letter and number, and minus your depreciation, which is B10, and put the $, okay, and minus your I payment. I'm not going to put this $, because this interest payment is going to be different for each year. So once I compute it, that gives me the income for tax purpose, okay, for year 1. For the remaining period, you can simply double click, that gives me the income. Now let's compute after tax income, which is simply 1 minus your tax rate, okay, tax rate times your income for tax purpose. Since the tax rate is going to be same for the rest of the period, I'm going to put $, between letter and numbers and enter. Okay, that's after tax income, and you can double click it. So that gives me after tax income. Now finally let's compute your annual cash flow. What is your annual cash flow? Remember, so your annual cash flow means after tax income, all right, that's negative, and that's your annual cash flow or part of the annual cash flow, but there are other expenses that you need to consider while computing annual cash flow, which is principal payment. That principal payment that you are making on your mortgage is your expense, right? Therefore, you have to subtract this. But the depreciation that you took out for tax purpose is not a cash outflow. Therefore, you have to add that depreciation back to your cash flow. So this is the trick right here. So your yearly depreciation must be added there, and that is going to be constant. So I'm going to fix this right here and then enter, and that is my first year's cash flow. If I double click it, it just gives me the cash flow for the remaining period. Okay, but one adjustment we need to make for our last period cash flow, because at the end of this 30 year you are going to sell your house, and by selling this house you are going to get your terminal cash flow. Therefore, you must add this terminal cash flow, okay, to your last period cash flow. So therefore I'm going to do this plus my terminal cash flow right here. So that means the cash flow for your investment analysis right here, let me make this a red color so it's easy to look at. So here on your rental property, your cash flow for the next 30 years seems like all going to be negative, right? And towards the end of that cash flow analysis, you sell it and you get the huge cash flow by selling it. So in that case, is this going to be profitable or not? How you decide? You compute NPV. So you can use Excel's NPV function, and it needs just two arguments. One is the rate. For our case, rate is simply the APR, and your cash flow is going to be all the future cash flow from your investment. That means the cash flow from year 1 to year 30. Okay, so if you do that and close your bracket and calculate that, and if you want to see the formula, I can also do this formula text right here. Okay, so that means the NPV is 311,446.30. That means if you undertake this investment and everything goes as you planned, your rent, your annual expenses, and the selling price of this house in 30, everything goes as planned, then you are going to make $311,446 in today's term. Okay, so this is the overall money that you can make by investing on this project. So this is how you calculate NPV, and then after computing NPV, you can make a decision whether this is a good investment or bad investment. And later, when you want to, play with this, what if you don't get 1.2 million and you get 1 million, or you can even get 1.5 million, right? And then monthly expenses may be more than 9,000 or less than 1,000. You can play around with this, but this is the way you set up the problem and solve this. And this is how you should do the financial analysis of your rental property. All right, thank you.